Welcome to the What Matters Today podcast from the Geneva Graduate Institute. I'm Dan Graham, Head of Communications at the Institute. In this podcast series, we ask members of our faculty to comment on key global issues. On Wednesday, 18 May, Finland and Sweden simultaneously handed in their official letters of application to join NATO. Both countries decided to do so following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. How will this impact both countries' relationship with Russia? Will Turkey block Finland and Sweden from becoming NATO members? Could Finland's and Sweden's membership and subsequent NATO expansion lead to a new Cold War? These are some of the questions that are discussed in this episode of What Matters Today. My guest today is Professor Jussi Hänemäki. Professor Hänemäki is Professor of International History and Politics and Chair of the Department of International History and Politics at the Geneva Graduate Institute. He has been a faculty member here since 2000. Professor Hänemäki was previously a lecturer at the London School of Economics. From 2002 to 2003, he was a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and is the recipient of the 2002 Bernath Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Relations. He was elected Finland Distinguished Professor in 2006. His main research interests include American foreign policy, transatlantic relations, and the international history of the Cold War. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has the world wondering what is next, and it seems like some countries would rather not wait to find out. Finland and Sweden have applied for NATO membership, ending their long-standing positions of neutrality. Historically, what has the relationship been with Russia, and why would the two Nordic countries want to join NATO now?
So if I work backwards, I think the trigger for wanting to join NATO is obviously what happened on February 24th of this year, and the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which led to a significant transformation, both in terms of the sort of existential security concerns that these two countries have. Finland bordering Russia, of course, 1,300 kilometers of border, which is more than Ukraine, actually. And so that's, and Sweden next door, obviously concerned with the implications of this. So that's led to a transformation in terms of internal politics, internal sort of opinion in Finland, and maybe a little bit less in Sweden, but certainly dramatically in Finland, where used to be about 30% of the population that was in favor of joining NATO suddenly jumped to about 75%, almost overnight. So that obviously put a lot of pressure on the president, on the government in Finland, and also in Sweden, and of course how the invasion unfolded in the weeks after February 24th. How sort of global public opinion, concerns about Russia's, these threats made about using nuclear weapons, whatnot. All of this added to the sort of concerns about, the fact that perhaps security was not limited to Ukraine, but that particularly when looking back, thinking about the last 20 years, what happened in Chechnya, what happened in Georgia, and of course, what happened in the Ukraine in 2014 with Crimea and so forth. So it's something that's been building up for quite some time, and I think the invasion, which came ironically the day after Finland defeated Russia in the Olympics in ice hockey, winning the gold medal. So there was some sort of sarcasm about that. That they were just waiting for that to happen. But it clearly, that was the moment that changed, the game changer, so to speak.
And NATO is looking at fast-tracking their membership. Mm-hmm. And why won't NATO do the same when it comes to Ukraine?
Well, I think at this moment, it's obviously, since the war started, it would basically mean declaring war on Russia, because Russia is at war with the Ukraine, and I think that's the situation in which it's hard to get impossible almost to get the 30 countries that are NATO members to agree on something like that. And so what you saw is this constant this sort of building up defenses in the NATO countries right closest to the action, so to speak. So Poland in particular. and of course the military assistance, increased military assistance to Ukraine that came up. But it is difficult. I think the same somewhat applies to the idea of Ukraine being fast-tracked for the European Union. It's again the concerns. What then would happen? What does that imply in terms of both NATO-Russia relations and then EU-Russia relations? So countries like Finland and Sweden, which are not members of NATO, which are not directly engaged in any conflict, which are already EU members, it's a different kind of constellation. And of course, if you're looking at it from the Ukraine, then you don't see it the same way. But I think that's the logic. Yeah.
Makes sense. What does Turkey have to do with all this? And why do they want to vote to block these Scandinavian countries' NATO membership?
Well, you can look at it in couple of ways. One is that Turkey is perhaps sort of Russia's Trojan horse in the NATO. I mean, that's one way of looking at it, and that making trouble within NATO is to keep the Russia-Turkey relationship, which has its ups and downs, but has been sort of fairly good, one could say, in the last decade or so. So that this is a sort of not necessarily against Sweden or Finland, but it's to keep that relationship alive. The other way of looking at it is simply that Turkey is not actually against it. They just want something. They get something out of this, and they've been talking about the Kurds and terrorists in Sweden and Finland and so forth. That I'm not sure how serious the concern that really is, but there may be other things that, of course, have been sort of floated around, but increased military, better American military equipment in return for dropping the veto in effect and so forth. So it's either or probably a combination of all this. So delicate relationship with Russia, delicate relationship with NATO as well, but then an opportunity because in the end, if one country says no, then it's not going to happen. So, Turkey, in that sense, is in a strong position in the immediate future, at least. But I would expect that there's going to be a lot of negotiation, and in the end, Turkey will give in in terms of. I mean, we'll get something. I don't know exactly what, but that there will be some kind of compromise.
And what will Finland's and Sweden's membership and subsequent NATO expansion mean for hopes of peaceful diplomatic relations between Russia and its neighbors to the west? Could this be the beginning of a new Cold War?
Well, it's certainly in the immediate, in the sort of short, medium term, probably it's going to make that relationship more difficult. And it's already, you see, obviously in Moscow, Finland joining NATO has not been welcomed, to say the least. They cut off electricity supplies that they were supplying about 10% of Finland's electricity the next day after the Finnish government announced they were doing this. They're cutting off gas supplies. Wow. So they're putting on pressure on Finland. It's not going to change the Finnish government's view, I don't think. Mm-hmm. I mean, that would be giving the blackmail and so forth. Yeah. But it's an indication of the fact that there's going to be a more difficult relationship, and that's it's same will apply, of course, to Sweden, which already had also a difficult relationship with Russia to begin with, and it is. I mean, the Ukraine war has clearly increased tensions between all of Russia and all of its neighbors to the west. So whether it's the Baltic states, whether it's Poland. All of these countries have geared up to potential that this military conflict might spill over. Will it lead to another Cold War? It depends a little bit what we mean by Cold War. There isn't the sort of. It's not the Cold War with capital C and capital W that we had pre-1990.
There'll be tension.
But there's going to be increased tension. There's no question about that. And then there are other players that will, in one way or another, have an impact on how that will be all resolved, and those would be countries like China, like India, and others who, where will they stand? How long will this conflict continue? Is there a possibility of some kind of ceasefire in the sort of not immediate but medium, perhaps later this year at some point? All of these things will have an impact. What happens internally in Russia also is going to have a big impact.
So quite a complex situation.
Oh yes.
That's it. That was the end of my list of questions. So thank you very much for joining us on this podcast episode.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much, Dan.
Thanks. That was Professor Jussi Hanamäki discussing Finland's and Sweden's application to join NATO. This podcast series is produced by the Geneva Graduate Institute Communications team. For more information about the Institute, please visit our website at graduateinstitute.ch. I'm Dan Graham. Thanks for listening.